There is a moment, usually quiet, usually unremarkable on the surface, when a person realizes they have spent their entire life performing for an audience that was never really watching as closely as they thought. It might happen at 35, lying awake at 2 in the morning after a perfectly fine day. It might happen at 50, standing in a kitchen that looks exactly like the life they were supposed to want. It might happen right now, as you listen to this. A quiet, almost unbearable question rises up from somewhere underneath all the noise. Who have I actually been living for? Not in a dramatic way, not as a crisis with a name, just a slow, sinking awareness that somewhere along the way, the voice making your decisions stopped being yours. It became a composite of every parent, teacher, partner, boss, and stranger whose opinion you were once taught mattered more than your own truth. Carl Jung spent his life studying this exact splitting. He watched patient after patient arrive in his office, outwardly successful, outwardly composed, and inwardly hollow. He called the mask people wear to be accepted by the world the persona. And he warned, again and again, that if you mistake the mask for your face, you will eventually lose track of what is underneath it entirely. This is a video about what happens when a person stops living for approval, not as a self-help slogan. As a real psychological process, one with real grief in it, real fear, real disorientation, and on the other side of it, something that can only be described as coming home. If any part of what I just said landed somewhere in your chest, stay with me. This isn't going to be one of those videos that tells you to just love yourself and move on. We're going to go slow, and we're going to go deep, because this pattern doesn't loosen its grip through slogans. It loosens through understanding. Let's begin where it actually begins, not in adulthood, where the symptoms show up, but much earlier, in the place where the strategy was born. Part 1. The architecture of approval. No child is born trying to please anyone. Watch a 2-year-old. They cry when they're upset. They laugh too loud. They say the wrong thing at the wrong time without a flicker of shame. They are, in the truest sense, themselves. There is no performance yet, because there has been no reason to perform. Then something happens. Slowly, and often without any cruelty involved at all, the child learns that certain parts of them are welcomed and certain parts are not. A flash of anger gets a parent's disapproving face. A burst of need gets met with irritation instead of comfort. An honest opinion gets laughed at, or worse, ignored. And the child's nervous system, which is built for one purpose above all others, survival through connection, draws a conclusion that will shape the next several decades of their life. The conclusion is this: my full self is not safe. Only the edited version is. This is not a story only for people who had visibly difficult childhoods. Some of the deepest approval seeking comes from homes that looked completely fine from the outside. A parent who loved conditionally but consistently, praising achievement, performance, good behavior, and growing quietly cold or anxious around vulnerability, anger, or difference. A household where love was real, but love and obedience were so tightly fused together that the child could never quite tell where one ended and the other began. So the child adapts. And adaptation at that age is genius. The child becomes whoever earns the warmest response. Funny if that gets attention. Quiet if that keeps the peace. Achieving if that earns pride. Agreeable if that prevents conflict. Not because they're weak, but because their entire survival, emotional and sometimes literal, depends on staying connected to the people raising them. This is the seed of what we now call people-pleasing. But notice something important. It didn't start as a personality trait. It started as a strategy. A brilliant, necessary, protective strategy built by a small nervous system trying to stay safe in a world it had no power to control. The tragedy is not that the strategy existed. The tragedy is that almost nobody is taught to retire it once it's no longer needed. So the child grows up. The body becomes an adult body. The world technically becomes survivable without anyone's approval at all. You can pay your own bills, make your own choices, leave a room you don't want to be in. And yet the old strategy doesn't know any of this happened. it is still operating as if the 4-year-old's survival depends on managing everyone else's emotional response to them. This is why a 40-year-old can intellectually know that their coworker's opinion of them doesn't actually threaten their life and still feel actual panic in their body at the thought of disappointing that coworker. The logical mind is in the present. The protective strategy is still living in childhood. Jung had a term for the parts of ourselves we learn to hide in order to be accepted. He called it the shadow, not because those parts are evil, but because they get pushed into darkness, out of the light of our own awareness, simply because they weren't welcomed. Anger you weren't allowed to express. Needs that were too inconvenient. Desires that didn't match what you were supposed to want. Ambition that made other people uncomfortable. Sadness that was too much for the room. All of it doesn't disappear. It goes underground. And it waits. This is your gentle reminder to keep listening, because what we're going to cover next, the actual cost of carrying this strategy into adulthood, is the part most people never have explained to them clearly. They just feel the exhaustion without understanding where it comes from. Stay through this one. It might explain more about your life than you expect. Part 2. The persona and the disappearing self. Jung described the persona as a kind of necessary mask, the face we show the world so that we can function within it. To some degree, everyone needs one. You behave differently at a funeral than at a birthday party. You speak differently to your boss than to your best friend. This is not pathological. This is simply social adaptation, and Jung never condemned it. The danger he pointed to was something more specific. He warned that a person can become so identified with their persona, so fused with the mask, that they forget there was ever a face underneath it. The performance stops being something they do and becomes something they believe they are. Picture the version of you that shows up to keep everyone comfortable. The one who agrees when they don't actually agree. The one who says, "I'm fine," when they are very much not fine. The one who softens their opinions before they're even fully formed, just in case someone disagrees. The one who over-explains a simple no with 3 apologies and a justification, as if asking for space requires a legal defense. That version of you is not fake, exactly. It's real, in the sense that it's really you performing it. But it is not whole. It is the edited, market-tested, conflict-avoidant cut of a much larger person who has been quietly waiting in the wings for years, sometimes for an entire lifetime. Here is the psychological cost, and it is significant. Every time you choose the approved response over the true one, you are not just managing someone else's feelings. You are teaching your own nervous system a lesson. The lesson is, your real reaction is not safe to have. And the more times that lesson gets reinforced, the harder it becomes to even locate your real reaction in the first place. This is why so many chronic people-pleasers describe a strange, disorienting symptom when they finally sit down to ask themselves what they actually want. They draw a blank. Not because they're shallow or lost causes, but because the question has been unasked for so long that the part of them responsible for answering it has gone quiet from disuse. Think about what that actually means. A person can reach midlife, having built a career, a family, a reputation, an entire visible structure of accomplishment, and still not be able to answer a basic question like, "What do I actually want for dinner?" without first running it through a filter of who might be inconvenienced by the answer. That is not a small problem. That is a person who has been systematically trained out of their own interiority. And the exhausting part, the part that makes approval-seeking so much more draining than people realize, is that it is never finished. There is no version of this strategy that reaches completion. You cannot please your way into permanent safety, because the moment you secure one person's approval, your nervous system simply moves the goalpost to the next person, the next room, the next possible disapproval on the horizon. It is a hunger that eating cannot satisfy, because the hunger was never really about the food. It was about safety, and safety built on other people's opinions is, by definition, never actually yours to keep. This is why people who live this way often describe feeling tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. It's not physical exhaustion. It's the exhaustion of constant self-monitoring, of running two minds at once, the one having the experience and the one watching how the experience is being received, of never fully arriving anywhere because part of you is always a few steps ahead, scanning the room for signs of disapproval before they even happen. Jung believed that this kind of self-abandonment doesn't just cause exhaustion. He believed it causes a kind of slow psychological death. Not dramatic, not visible from the outside, but real. A person can be technically alive, technically successful, technically liked by everyone they know, and still be quietly disappearing inside their own life, because the self that's living it isn't really them. He wrote about the danger of living what he called the unlived life, the version of you that never got to exist because it was never approved of. And he believed that the unlived life doesn't simply vanish. It accumulates. It shows up later as depression with no clear cause, as resentment that seems to come from nowhere, as a strange grief for a version of yourself you can't quite name, but somehow know you lost. If you've ever felt a sadness you couldn't explain, sitting in the middle of an otherwise good life, this might be part of what it's pointing to. Let's go deeper into why this happens, why approval becomes such a powerful substitute for genuine love. Because understanding the difference between the two is going to matter enormously for what comes later in this video. Part 3. Being liked versus being loved. There is a distinction that almost nobody draws clearly enough, and once you see it, you can't unsee it in your own life. Being liked and being loved are not the same experience, and they are not even built from the same material. Being liked is conditional. It is earned through performance, maintained through compliance, and withdrawn the moment you stop delivering whatever it was that earned it in the first place. Being liked says, I approve of the version of you that is currently convenient for me. Being loved is different. Being loved says, I see the parts of you that aren't convenient, the anger, the need, the mess, the contradiction, and I'm still here. Being loved doesn't require a performance. It survives the absence of one. Here is the painful truth that approval seeking hides from you. You cannot actually test whether you are loved as long as you never stop performing. If you are always managing how you're perceived, always smoothing your edges, always agreeing before you've even checked in with what you think, you will never find out whether the people around you love the real you, because the real you has never been given the chance to show up. This is one of the cruelest side effects of chronic approval seeking. It doesn't just exhaust you, it actively prevents you from ever receiving the very thing you're starving for. You can collect 1,000 instances of being liked and still feel desperately unloved, because liking was never going to satisfy a hunger that only love can meet. And love, real love, requires being known, not just approved of. This is why some people can be surrounded by admiration, friends, followers, colleagues who speak highly of them, and still feel a bone-deep loneliness they can't explain to anyone. They are liked extensively. They are known barely at all. And on some level they're aware that if they stop performing, if they let the mask slip even for a moment, they have no real evidence that the warmth would survive it. That uncertainty is terrifying enough that most people never test it. They keep performing indefinitely, telling themselves the warmth they're receiving is proof of connection, when really it's only proof of a successful act. If this is starting to feel uncomfortably familiar, that discomfort is useful information. Let it sit with you for a moment instead of rushing past it. And if you want to keep sitting with these ideas after this video ends, this channel is built around exactly this kind of work, so it might be worth staying close to. Now let's talk about the emotion underneath all of this, because approval seeking is not really driven by a desire to be liked. It's driven by something much older and much more uncomfortable to look at directly. Part 4. Shame, fear, and the logic of self-abandonment. Underneath almost every pattern of chronic approval seeking is a single, quiet belief, rarely spoken aloud, sometimes not even fully conscious. If people saw who I really am, they would leave. This belief is shame, and shame behaves very differently from guilt. Guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I am something bad. Guilt can usually be repaired through an apology or a changed behavior. Shame cannot be repaired that way because it isn't really about behavior at all. It's about identity. And when shame is the engine running underneath your need for approval, no amount of external validation will ever fully quiet it, because you're trying to use evidence from the outside to settle a verdict that was issued on the inside. This is why praise so often fails to land for people who are deeply shame-driven. They can receive a genuine compliment and immediately discount it. They assume the other person doesn't have the full picture, or is just being polite, or will eventually see through them. The compliment bounces off because it was never going to be enough. Shame doesn't need more evidence. It needs to be addressed directly, which is a very different process than collecting approval. Fear works alongside shame, and the specific fear at the center of all this is the fear of rejection. Not rejection in some abstract sense, but the felt, bodily memory of what it once meant to be rejected by the people you depended on for survival. For a child, disconnection from a caregiver isn't just emotionally painful. It registers, somewhere in the deep, ancient parts of the brain, as a genuine threat to life. That registration doesn't update itself automatically just because you grew up. The body keeps score long after the mind has moved on. So when an adult feels a wave of anxiety at the thought of disappointing someone, even someone whose opinion shouldn't matter much at all, what's actually happening underneath the surface is an old alarm system firing exactly as it was built to. It's not weakness. It's not irrationality. It's an outdated protection mechanism doing exactly what it was trained to do, just in a context that no longer requires it. This is where self-abandonment enters the picture, and it deserves to be named clearly because it is one of the most under-discussed forms of self-harm that exists. Self-abandonment is the act of leaving yourself, your needs, your truth, your boundaries, your instincts, in order to stay connected to someone else. It rarely looks dramatic. It looks like silence when you wanted to speak. It looks like agreement when you actually disagreed. It looks like smiling through something that hurt. It looks like saying yes while every part of your body was screaming no. Each instance seems small on its own. But self-abandonment compounds the same way debt compounds. Every time you choose someone else's comfort over your own truth, you make a tiny withdrawal from your own sense of self. And withdrawals, repeated over years, eventually leave the account empty. This is the real hidden cost of chronic approval seeking. Not just tiredness, not just frustration, an actual erosion of the relationship you have with yourself, until many people, by the time they reach their 30s or 40s, realize with a kind of quiet horror that they don't actually know who they are outside of how they've learned to be useful, agreeable, or impressive to others. If you're noticing yourself in this, I want to be clear about something. This isn't a character flaw. This was intelligent adaptation once. You built this pattern because it worked, because it kept you connected to people you needed. The goal here isn't to shame yourself for having shame. The goal is to finally see the mechanism clearly enough to begin loosening its grip. We're now about halfway through this exploration, and this is usually the point where the real shift starts to happen for people. The moment understanding turns into recognition, and recognition starts to feel less like information and more like relief. If that's happening for you right now, it might be worth pausing to let it land, or returning to this video again later when you need the reminder. Let's look now at what this pattern does to your actual life, your energy, your relationships, your boundaries, because the psychological cost doesn't stay contained inside your inner world. It bleeds outward into everything you build. Part 5. Energy, boundaries, and the relationships. Built on performance, people who live for approval are, without exception, exhausted people. Not lazy, not unmotivated, often the opposite, high-functioning, high-achieving, constantly busy. But underneath the productivity is a kind of fatigue that never fully resolves because so much of their energy is being spent on something almost nobody else can see. The constant internal labor of managing how they're perceived. Consider what's actually involved in a single approval-seeking interaction. Before speaking, there's a scan. Will this be well received? While speaking, there's a monitor. How is this landing? After speaking, there's a replay. Did I say the right thing? Did I sound okay? Was that too much? Was that not enough? This entire process happens in seconds, often unconsciously, but it happens constantly, across nearly every interaction, all day, every day. That is an enormous amount of cognitive and emotional labor, invisible to everyone except the person living inside it. This is why approval-driven people often describe needing more recovery time after socializing than seems to make sense given how easy the interaction looked from the outside. The interaction wasn't actually easy. It was a performance, monitored in real time, and performances require energy that simple presence does not. Now extend this pattern across boundaries. A boundary at its core is a statement of truth. This is acceptable to me, and this is not. But stating a boundary requires the very thing approval-seeking trains you out of, the willingness to risk someone's disapproval in service of your own truth. This is why boundaries feel almost physically impossible for many people, not because they don't know what their limits are, but because enforcing those limits requires tolerating the discomfort of someone else's potential disappointment, and tolerating that discomfort is precisely the skill that was never allowed to develop. So instead, boundaries get replaced with management. Instead of saying no, a person overextends and then quietly resents the person they overextended for. Instead of expressing hurt, they withdraw silently and call it being mature. Instead of asking directly for what they need, they hint, hope, and eventually feel invisible when no one reads their mind correctly. None of this is dishonest in intention. It's a survival adaptation operating exactly as designed, but it slowly poisons relationships from the inside, because relationships cannot be built on unspoken truths. They can only be built on real ones. And here is something crucial that approval-seeking people rarely realize until much later. The relationships built primarily on performance are fragile in a way that has nothing to do with how much affection is present. They're fragile because they were never tested against the truth. The other person likes the version of you that shows up. But nobody, including you, actually knows whether they would stay if the performance stopped. This creates a strange paradox. The more a person performs to maintain a relationship, the less secure that relationship actually becomes, even as it appears, from the outside, increasingly stable. Because security in a relationship doesn't come from being liked consistently. It comes from being known and accepted, including the parts that aren't impressive, aren't easy, aren't convenient. Jung believed that real intimacy, real connection, was only possible between two people willing to encounter each other's whole selves, shadow included. A relationship built entirely on persona, two masks smiling politely at each other, might look peaceful, but it isn't intimate. It's a well-managed transaction. And transactions, no matter how pleasant, leave people quietly starving for something realer. This is precisely why so many people describe feeling lonely inside relationships that look, by every external measure, completely fine. They are not lying when they say things are fine. Things are fine. What's missing is depth, and depth requires risk that the performance was specifically designed to avoid. If any part of this is landing close to home, you're not alone in this, and that's actually part of why this channel exists, to walk through exactly this kind of territory with you, slowly and honestly. If it would help to have more conversations like this one waiting for you, you know what to do. Now let's turn toward the harder, more hopeful part of this conversation. What it actually looks like to begin reclaiming the self that's been buried under all of this performance, and why Jung believed this process, however difficult, is the most important work a person can ever undertake. Part 6. Individuation and the return to the real self. Jung gave a name to the lifelong process of becoming who you actually are, underneath every mask, every adaptation, every approval-seeking strategy built in childhood. He called it individuation. Not self-improvement in the way we usually think of it, not optimizing yourself into a better performing version of the persona, but something almost the opposite. A process of integration, of bringing the disowned, hidden, shadowed parts of yourself back into conscious awareness, and learning to live as a whole person instead of a curated fragment. Individuation is not comfortable. Jung never pretended it would be. It requires a willingness to look directly at the parts of yourself you've spent a lifetime hiding: the anger, the need, the ambition, the grief, the desires that don't match what you were taught to want, and to stop treating them as problems to manage and start treating them as information about who you actually are. This is where the real work of stepping out of approval seeking begins, and it starts with something deceptively simple and genuinely difficult: learning to notice the gap between your authentic reaction and your performed one. This noticing has to happen in real time, in small moments, long before it can happen in big ones. It might look like catching yourself mid-sentence, about to say it's totally fine when it isn't totally fine, and pausing instead of finishing the sentence on autopilot. It might look like noticing the tightness in your chest when you're about to agree to something you don't actually want to do, and treating that tightness as data instead of an inconvenience to override. This is slow work. There is no shortcut through it, and anyone promising you one is selling something. But each moment of noticing is a small act of return, a small refusal to abandon yourself in favor of someone else's comfort. And those small refusals, repeated over months and years, are what actually rebuild the relationship with the self that approval-seeking spent a lifetime dismantling. As this process deepens, something significant starts to shift. The question that used to run automatically in the background of every interaction, "Will this be approved of?" starts to be replaced by a different, quieter question: "Is this true for me?" It sounds like a small change. It is not. It is the difference between living as a reflection of other people's expectations and living as the author of your own life. This shift comes with real grief, and it deserves to be named honestly rather than glossed over. As you stop performing for approval, some relationships that were built entirely on your compliance will not survive the change. Some people in your life have only ever known the curated version of you, and when the real version starts showing up instead, agreeing less easily, expressing needs more directly, saying no without 3 paragraphs of justification, some of those people will be confused, some will be hurt, and some will quietly drift away. This is one of the hardest truths about reclaiming yourself. Not everyone was actually attached to you. Some people were attached to your usefulness, your agreeableness, your predictability. Losing their approval when you stop performing for it isn't a sign you're doing something wrong. It's evidence that the relationship was built on the mask, not the face underneath it, and no amount of authenticity could have saved a connection that was never really about you in the first place. Grieving this is appropriate. It's allowed. You're not just losing people sometimes. You're losing a version of yourself that, however exhausting, was familiar. There is real loss in letting go of an identity you've worn for decades, even when that identity was never fully yours. Let yourself feel that loss without rushing past it. Healing isn't a straight line, and it isn't supposed to feel triumphant the entire way through. But on the other side of that grief is something Jung described as one of the most important developments a person can experience: the slow construction of a life and a set of relationships built on truth instead of performance. Friendships where you don't have to monitor yourself constantly. A partnership where disagreement doesn't feel like a threat to the bond, because the bond was never built on agreement in the first place. A sense of self that doesn't fluctuate wildly based on whether the last interaction went well, because it's no longer being constructed moment to moment out of other people's reactions. This is the quiet, undramatic miracle that happens when someone finally stops outsourcing their sense of self. They start to feel, often for the first time since early childhood, like a continuous person. Someone who exists whether or not anyone in the room approves of them in this particular moment. Someone whose worth isn't being negotiated and renegotiated in every single interaction. Part 7. What actually changes? Let's talk concretely about what shifts when a person genuinely stops living for approval, because the changes are real, specific, and worth naming clearly. The first thing that changes is energy. An enormous amount of mental and emotional bandwidth that used to be spent monitoring, managing, and adjusting becomes available for actually living. People who do this work often describe feeling, almost physically, like something heavy has been set down. Decisions that used to take days of anxious deliberation start happening in minutes, because the deliberation was never really about the decision. It was about anticipating everyone else's possible reaction to it. The second thing that changes is relationships. Some end, as we discussed, and that loss is real. But the relationships that remain tend to deepen significantly, because for the first time, the people in your life are responding to you, not to a curated performance of you. This is frightening at first and then, gradually, becomes the most stabilizing thing a person has ever experienced. Being loved for the real thing is a fundamentally different feeling than being liked for the performance, and once you've tasted the former, the latter stops being satisfying in the way it used to be. The third thing that changes is decision-making. Without the constant background calculation of what will be approved of, decisions start to be made from a different place entirely, something closer to instinct or values or simple, honest preference. This often surprises people. They discover they have actual opinions about things they thought they were neutral on. They find out they want things they had quietly suppressed wanting for years, because wanting them never seemed safe or convenient. The fourth thing that changes is the relationship with conflict. Disagreement stops feeling like a five-alarm threat and starts feeling like a normal, survivable part of being in relationship with other separate human beings. This alone changes the texture of a person's entire life. So much approval-seeking behavior exists specifically to avoid conflict, and once conflict is no longer terrifying, an enormous number of exhausting management behaviors simply become unnecessary. The fifth thing that changes, and perhaps the most important, is the relationship with the self. This is the thing Jung was pointing toward the entire time, with all his talk of persona and shadow and individuation. The goal was never to become unlikable or combative or indifferent to others. The goal was wholeness. A person who can hold their own opinions, needs, and truths with the same seriousness they've spent a lifetime giving to everyone else's. This doesn't mean becoming selfish. It means becoming someone whose care for others is no longer funded by self-abandonment. There is a profound difference between kindness that flows from genuine generosity and kindness that flows from fear of disapproval. The first is sustainable, nourishing, freely given. The second is a slow-motion debt that eventually comes due, usually as resentment, burnout, or a quiet collapse that looks, from the outside, like it came out of nowhere. When you stop living for approval, your kindness doesn't disappear. It gets purified. You start giving because you want to, not because you're afraid of what happens if you don't. And the people who deserve your presence will find that version of you not less lovable, but more. Part 8. The Return. There's a particular kind of moment that people describe when they've done enough of this work, and it's worth painting clearly, because it's the destination this entire process is pointing toward. It's not a dramatic moment, usually. It's something small, saying no to a request without rehearsing an explanation first, sitting with someone's disappointment without immediately trying to fix it, voicing an unpopular opinion and feeling, instead of panic, a strange and unfamiliar steadiness, looking in the mirror and recognizing with something close to surprise the person looking back. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not who you were trained to be in order to stay safe in rooms that no longer hold any power over you, not the edited, agreeable, palatable version assembled out of decades of other people's reactions. The actual, whole, contradictory, real person who was always underneath all of it, waiting, patiently, for you to stop abandoning them. This doesn't happen all at once. There's no single decision that completes it. It happens in thousands of small moments, choosing truth over comfort, presence over performance, your own quiet knowing over the loudest disapproval in the room. Some days you'll do it easily. Other days the old patterns will pull hard, and you'll catch yourself performing before you even realize you've started. That's not failure. That's the actual texture of this kind of change. It's not linear, and it's not supposed to be. What changes, over time, is not that the fear disappears completely. It's that the fear stops being the one making your decisions. You start to be able to feel afraid of disapproval and act in alignment with your truth anyway, which is a completely different skill than not feeling afraid at all. That skill, the ability to act from truth, even in the presence of fear, is what Jung was really describing when he talked about individuation. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of a self solid enough to hold the struggle without dissolving into it. If you've made it this far, I want to say something directly to you, not as a script, but as the simplest truth I can offer. The version of you that exists underneath all the performing is not too much. It was never too much. It was simply too much for people who needed you small, agreeable, or convenient, and their need for that was never actually your responsibility to manage. You are allowed to take up the space your real self requires. You are allowed to disappoint people in service of your own honesty. You are allowed to be loved for the truth instead of admired for the act. This isn't selfishness. It's the most basic form of self-respect there is, and it's available to you the moment you decide that your own approval finally matters more than everyone else's. If this video gave you something to sit with, let it actually sit. Don't rush into the next video looking for the next insight before this one has had a chance to settle. Real change doesn't come from consuming more information. It comes from returning, again and again, to the moments in your actual life where you have the chance to choose truth over performance, and choosing it, slowly, imperfectly, one small moment at a time. If you want to keep doing this kind of work, this channel will be here, exploring exactly this territory, the parts of the self that get hidden, the cost of hiding them, and the long, worthwhile process of bringing them home. Subscribe if that's something you want to keep returning to. And if no one has said this to you in a long time, you don't need anyone's permission to become who you actually are. You only ever needed your own.